In 1927, Calvin Coolidge was a very popular president. He had been president ever since Warren G. Harding died in office suddenly in 1923. His popularity as president helped the public forget about the multiple scandals in the Harding administration, the most well-known of these being the infamous Teapot Dome scandal. Coolidge had been completely unconnected with the scandals, and him being in charge helped the Republican Party repair its image in the aftermath. And in the 1924 election, Coolidge was elected in his own right. 3 years later, as the next election loomed on the horizon, Coolidge made a shocking announcement. It was the summer of 1927, an exciting time in America. Under President Calvin Coolidge's administration, the economy was booming. To the public at large, it didn't seem like it would be slowing down anytime soon, and Coolidge's reputation was doing very well. But on August 2nd, while on vacation in South Dakota, the president shocked everyone by suddenly announcing at a press conference that he would not be seeking re-election in 1928. The public was shocked, the news reporters were shocked, the Republican Party was shocked. The drama was only heightened by the fact that Coolidge had told no one about it beforehand, not even his wife. It was almost certainly not a coincidence that he had chosen to make this statement exactly 4 years after he had been sworn in after the sudden death of Harding. Coolidge's exact words were, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was it, 12 words. When reporters asked if he had further comments, Coolidge simply said, none. Many took the statement to mean what seemed the most obvious interpretation, while others viewed it as more open-ended. And there was a big debate about whether Coolidge had secretly implied anything, and especially what he meant by choose. The big question that Coolidge did not or would not answer was that if he were nominated in 1928, would he accept the nomination? Even if he chose not to run, would he if he was chosen by his party? Those who had a more open-ended interpretation couldn't understand why Coolidge would have purposely been so vague, especially when pressed for an explanation, unless he meant that he wouldn't rule out serving as president for another term. Coolidge was an old-fashioned kind of person. And in the past, presidential hopefuls were not supposed to actively push for themselves in the nomination process as a demonstration of modesty, and some thought that this seemed like his style. While Republicans were surprised and a bit disappointed, the party wasn't angry or anything. Coolidge made his announcement a full 10 months before the Republican National Convention would be held, and there were plenty of presidential hopefuls in the party who were eager to put their hats in the ring. Herbert Hoover, for instance, had never wanted to run if Coolidge intended to, and all potential candidates knew they wouldn't have stood a chance against Coolidge. Now the field was wide open for the Republican nomination. The president's announcement was big news, really big news. The New York Times for August 3rd gave it a massive headline, and discussion about it took up most of the front page and continued for a couple more pages. And the reporting sometimes went into minute detail. Take this example from the aforementioned New York Times front page story. I do not choose to run for president in 1928. This brief sentence was written by him on a slip of paper at 9:32 a.m., and later transcribed by stenographers to a slip of paper 5 inches by 2 inches. The year was put in words, not figures, and so made a 12-word statement. Coolidge was from rural Vermont, and was thoroughly New England in his thinking. This affected his personality quite a bit, and contributed to his sense of humor, which many from other areas of the country often had trouble understanding. To those who understood Coolidge's New England character, the message was clear. The news publication The Outlook wrote, "Whoever knows New England knows what President Coolidge meant. If a New Englander does not choose to do something, he will not do it. Are you going to the dance this evening? A young man in a New England village is asked. If he replies, "I don't choose to go," wild horses cannot drag him. Nowhere in the world has the will received such exercise as in the New England states. Conduct there is a matter of choice. President Coolidge meant precisely what he said and said precisely what he meant. And that is in fact what Coolidge meant. Choosing not to run meant he would not run or accept the nomination. But regardless, to many who weren't familiar with New England mannerisms, Coolidge's statement still wasn't 100% clear. There was a push to renominate him, but it didn't gain much traction, though he still received 17 votes in the nomination ballot. So, why did he do this? His official explanation, which he wrote in the last chapter of his autobiography, published in 1929, was that if he were re-elected, then by the time his second term had finished, he would have been president for 10 years. George Washington had set a precedent by stepping down after 2 terms. And as of 1927, no president had served more than 2 terms. There wasn't a law regarding term limits, and Coolidge still technically wouldn't have been breaking the precedent since for his first 2 years as president, he was just finishing Harding's unfinished term in office. But Coolidge generally stuck by his principles pretty strictly, and he looked at the issue not as terms, but as years. 2 terms was 8 years, and 10 years was more than that, so it just felt wrong to him. Or, as he said in his own words, "The presidential office is of such a nature that it is difficult to conceive how one man can successfully serve his country for a term of more than 8 years." Coolidge thought that some people might see the president as greedy or selfish if he tried to stay president for so long. He also believed that so much time in office would distort the president's perspective. He would be surrounded by overly deferential and perhaps sycophantic people, and would become arrogant and thus unworthy to occupy the office after a certain point. And because his image was that he was a man of principles and honor, it might have been damaged if people saw him that way. Even though it technically wouldn't have been a 3rd term, some might have thought it was close enough and viewed him negatively for it. He also expressed concern that while his and his wife's health had been good up to that point, another term might change that. And there was also another big reason for his decision not to run again that he didn't directly address in his official explanation. But knowing more context, you could infer that Coolidge vaguely hinted at it. Just before campaigning for the 1924 election started, his 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., died tragically from a blood infection. President Coolidge didn't let his emotions show publicly, but according to the few accounts of his reaction and mental state afterward, he was heartbroken and emotionally run down. He wrote of Calvin Jr. in his autobiography, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." And that's pretty much all he wrote about the matter. He still went through with the 1924 election and won an easy victory. But privately, as that last quote implies, it seemed like his heart was just not in it anymore, and he may very well have been suffering from depression throughout the rest of his presidency. Some of those around him later said that it was shortly after he won the 1924 election that he expressed a desire to not seek re-election again. So, for the public, Coolidge's statement was sudden and unexpected, but for him, it was something he had been thinking about for a while. Less than 2 years after Calvin Jr.'s death, Coolidge's father, John Coolidge, also died. Even though this time it was due to natural causes, Coolidge had been very close to his father, and it just added to his anguish. He may have been hinting at how hard both of these deaths hit him when he wrote in his autobiography, "The presidential office takes a heavy toll of those who occupy it and those who are dear to them. While we should not refuse to spend and be spent in the service of our country, it is hazardous to attempt what we feel is beyond our strength to accomplish." There may have been another reason as well, though this one is a bit more speculative, but I'll tack it on just for the sake of being thorough. I think we all know about the stock market crash in 1929, and this was in stark contrast to the seemingly booming economy in the Coolidge years. Coolidge himself was by no means an expert on economic matters, but he did talk with a prominent Harvard economist named William Z. Ripley. Ripley was one of the handful of economic experts who warned about an impending economic crisis, and had published his reservations as early as 1926. Coolidge was known to have talked privately with Ripley, who told the president that the national government probably wouldn't be able to avert the crisis on its own without close cooperation at the state level. It's possible that Coolidge believed Ripley, and that another term in office would bring ruin to his reputation, despite how good it had been before. Herbert Hoover, who also had private worries about the state of the economy before the crash and the Great Depression, was of course left to face the crisis, and came out of it with his political reputation in shambles. It's certainly possible that Coolidge would not have performed much better, if not worse, since the initial stock market crash was pretty much inevitable at some point. Hoover was more knowledgeable than Coolidge on economic matters, and it still went badly for him. And Coolidge, like many others in the Republican Party at the time, generally had a hands-off approach when it came to the economy. If he had been convinced that something bad loomed on the horizon, he might have wanted to get out before it happened. But like I said before, that is all speculative. There is no definitive evidence that Coolidge seriously believed that an economic crash would come in the near future. While this foreboding thought is much less likely to have really influenced Coolidge's decision not to run again, it could have pushed him further in that direction. Coolidge's rather dramatic announcement that he wouldn't run for president in 1928 became ingrained in pop culture, and there was even a song titled "I Do Not Choose to Run" made in 1928. The lyrics don't directly reference Coolidge, but the title and chorus were definitely inspired by his famous quote. I love that every time something became pop culture in the 1920s, there was always a novelty song about it. It's one of those small things that I enjoy about that time period, and I promise there are plenty more to go through in future videos. The song "I Do Not Choose to Run" is actually pretty catchy, so I'll play the chorus and hope I don't get copyright claimed.
I do not choose to run, I do not choose to run. Try and shake me, you can't take me, my spring days are done. Wind me up once more, then drop me on the floor. Now I don't care, I just declare I do not choose to run.
And that just about does it for this video. I'm experimenting with different kinds of video topics, so let me know what you thought about this one in the comments. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.